Hi, it's Dr. Emily Cooper. Are you a healthcare professional who wants to expand your clinical expertise and your approach to treating obesity? Beginning November 7th, I'm offering a 3-part, 20-credit live virtual course through the Diabesity Institute. This course will focus on science-based insights into diagnosing and treating metabolic disorders. I've treated thousands of patients over the past 25 years. Our clinics recorded their outcomes in a comprehensive database, and I've learned a lot that I'd love to share with you. If you're looking for clarity, a greater diagnostic understanding, and effective treatment strategies, for more information and for the official credit statement, visit fatsciencepodcast.com and click on the provider course link at the top of the homepage. All right, now to the show. The thing about the microdosing is it's so popular now. So many people are saying, well, I'm microdosing these GLP-1s and microdosing tirzepatide. And my thought is, well, do you have a metabolic dysfunction problem or not? Because if you don't have a problem with your metabolism that requires that medication, you shouldn't be taking any medication like that. And if you do have a problem with your metabolism, probably anything that really meets the definition for microdosing would be too low to help you, unless you're in a certain situation where you're in a medically supervised tapering process. So that's where there's a lot of confusion.
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper, two of my favorite people on the planet. Hello, how are you?
Hi.
Hello.
All right, on the show this week, we're talking about microdosing because microdosing has become hugely popular.
Very.
People taking small doses of metabolic drugs that they think will have a positive impact on their health and their metabolism. Dr. Cooper is here today to say that microdosing might not be what you think it is, and it might even not be something that you should be doing. So I guess we need to set the baseline, Dr. Cooper. What is microdosing? What's the official definition that we need to know?
Well, just from a medical standpoint, a microdose would be using a dose that is far below a standard dose, a standard therapeutic dose. And so with medications, most medications have a dose range, a therapeutic dose range that goes from a low end to the maximum. And doctors sometimes will prescribe the low end, and sometimes they'll prescribe the maximum. And it's usually based on an individual's need, and it's always based on that and their clinical presentation, their clinical needs. And so we're used to, as doctors, prescribing medication like that. And what a microdose would refer to would be something below that therapeutic range, something that's not a standard dose that's supplied by a pharmaceutical company, and not, even at the low end of the therapeutic range. It would be something below the starting doses of medication.
So I have to ask, as drugs are approved by the FDA, is the dosing range part of the formal application process and part of the formal approval process? Like, we've approved rosuvastatin for blood pressure and 5 milligrams to 25 milligrams. I mean, in the approval process, are those parameters spelled out?
I believe they are, the FDA indications for medication are to treat it within a certain dose range. And that's the dose range that's been shown to be safe and effective by the clinical trials. And so we see it in every medication group. So if you have, high blood pressure, you may be on a medication that has a dose range from 50 to 300 milligrams. And then the doctor will figure out what dose do you need based on your blood pressure response. And they may increase the dose at times, and they may decrease the dose at times, and they may end up tapering the dose all the way off. And in the tapering off process, they may find that they want to use half of the lowest dose that's supplied by the company as a stepping off to nothing point, just as a tapering process, so they can monitor the blood pressure as they're doing that. But most often, people are treated within this broad dose range. And the same thing's true for the GLP-1 GIP when it's prescribed for diabetes. It's, this is how the drug comes, and it's called how supplied, how the drug is supplied. So if you think of something like semaglutide Ozempic for diabetes, it's supplied in a form that the lowest dose is 0.25 milligrams, and for diabetes, the highest dose is 2 milligrams. And then it's up to the provider to figure out what dose does my patient need based on how their response is, their severity of diabetes, and all of that. And so they would still be in that therapeutic range, even if they're on 0.25 or 0.5. It's not only that they're in the therapeutic range if they're on the maximum dose. But what's kind of interesting is when it comes to the weight-related treatment, the drug companies are so nervous, I guess, or something, that they made the indications say, or not the indications, they made the prescribing information say, this is how you treat every single patient, no matter who they are. This is the starting dose. So for Wegovy, 0.25. And then you do these dose escalations at this frequency until you're up to the max dose, which for Wegovy is 2.4. For Zepbound, this is the starting dose, 2.5, and you do dose escalations until you're up to the max dose, which is 15. And that's supposed to be for all patients. And doctors are just ignoring that because it's ridiculous. I mean, doctors would never prescribe medicine like that. If they did, it would be like a total failure of what they are trained to do. So doctors are going to prescribe medication based on how the patient is responding, just like they do for any disease process, anything. Obesity is no different. It's just like any other, medical condition. And by doing it this way that the drug companies are saying, they're recommending that because that's what they're replicating what they did in the clinical trial. But the reason they did that in the clinical trials is because they wanted to test the max dose. And there's an acclimation period with each dose increase that you have to go through. So they had to start at the lowest dose for X amount of time, go to the next dose for X amount of time until they got to the max dose, because they had to test the max dose because they have to prove safety and effectiveness at the full dose range. And so that was kind of misinterpreted as everyone should be doing that in real life. And it just doesn't make any kind of medical sense. And I think maybe some doctors that aren't familiar with this area of treatment might have started out trying to do it that way and realizing very quickly that's just not right for everyone. So there will be patients who do great on even the lowest dose or, one of the lower doses. And there may be other patients who go to the max dose, have to go all the way up, and it doesn't do anything for them. So just like every other medicine. And so I think that there's like a misunderstanding. And so then some people are mistakenly thinking that they're microdosing if they're not on the max dose or if they're on a lower dose. And that's just not true. That's not considered a microdose. A microdose would be, technically a microdose would be something below how the drug is supplied. And so that's where I think there's a lot of confusion. So everyone's talking about microdosing. When you kind of look into it, they may be on just a normal therapeutic dose, but a lower part of the dose range.
Andrea, you're in Los Angeles, which is a very different city from Seattle.
or a lot of the country.
They don't call it La La Land for nothing. But microdosing is something that you've heard a lot of down there.
I hear about people, and I don't always know what dose they're on, but I hear about people doing lower doses of either Wegovy or Ozempic or Mounjaro, one of those drugs. And they say that they're doing it because taking a small dose of those drugs keeps their appetite at bay or keeps them satisfied and keeps things in check. That's what they always say. It keeps them in check. I don't know what that means. I don't know necessarily. They just always say it keeps them regulated. And some of them may have a metabolic problem, but a lot of them don't seem to have a metabolic problem. It just sort of seems to be trendy. That's the thing to do. You take a little of this drug every week, and it keeps you regulated, not eating as much, and restaurants are not as happy with everybody because they're not eating as much.
But I'm wondering, Andrea, is that something they decided to do on their own, or did a doctor tell them to do that?
I think it's something, I think a lot of times the drug is, it might be a compounded version of the drug, or maybe they got it from a doctor and it's left over from something else. I don't know how they're getting it. I really don't.
Yeah. So, Dr. Cooper, how should we look? I think, and this may be completely wrong, but when I look at foods and things that are beneficial for the human body, when you think about, fatty acids, and when you think about monounsaturated oils and things like that, a little bit of that every day is a good thing because it generally has a good effect. So I'm guessing that people are thinking the same thing translates to medication, that because it's good to do this with food, then I guess the medication in a little amount would do that. But it just seems
Right.
like if you're not measuring the result, this is really just a big question mark, isn't it?
Well, it is a question mark. And I think as a physician, I always think, does this patient need treatment with a drug like this in the first place or not? Because the worst thing you can do is actually put someone on a medication when they don't need it. And that's for a lot of reasons. Because, first of all, if you have a normal metabolic system or even a metabolic dysfunction that's not necessarily at a level that you would need to use something like a GLP-1 or GIP drug, and then you start that medication, you could create a metabolic problem for somebody. We already talked about how sometimes these medications can impair your appetite and they can cause side effects. And so then if that starts happening, a person with a normal, strong metabolism could end up with a weaker metabolism. And so, of course, you're going to think about it. Now, I do get patients in who are sort of a little bit borderline, and you add up all the things. It's almost like there's this little dysfunction here, but there's a strength here, but now there's another dysfunction here, and now another dysfunction starts to outweigh the strengths, and then the argument gets stronger for maybe, in some cases, people do need to do a low dose in the therapeutic range, where they may not be somebody who has such a strong problem that you would envision them needing to go to higher doses. But again, that's not the same as when people are tossing around this term microdosing and doing it to prevent something that's not even there. To me, it seems really risky because anytime we introduce something to our system that alters our hormonal state, we're risking that we are creating in our body, we're changing the environment in our body. And we may be tricking our body or fooling it or confusing it. Because don't forget, GLP-1s are a natural part of our body that our body makes. And if we add the GLP-1 or the GIP, is that going to impact our natural GIP-1 or GIP hormones when we didn't have a problem with them in the first place? Is it going to make our body think it doesn't need to produce them as much? Is it going to maybe weaken our physiologic capacity to produce those hormones by just taking a substitute? So that's one of the concerns, is could that happen? And we have examples from other drugs where that does occur.
I mean, you think about the classic example of microdosing was back in the day, everybody was saying, yeah, you should take a baby aspirin a day to prevent heart disease, to prevent stroke and stuff like that. And then I think the research came back that said, well, if you don't suffer from heart disease, that might actually be a bad thing, and you might be thinning your blood out too much. Is that a good example, Dr. Cooper, of sort of where we got the idea of microdosing and how sort of universally accepted it is?
I mean, I think that is a pretty good a comparison. The only difference is that the baby aspirin's still kind of in the therapeutic dose range, I guess. Or, well, maybe not. Yeah, you're right. It is a pediatric dose in an adult. I think that is actually a very good example
That's interesting.
of something that we did find later to be detrimental to people who did not need it. But it's still recommended for people if you have a very high coronary artery calcium score. The baby aspirin is recommended in that group because it's shown the risk-benefit ratio favors, yes, you should take it. So actually, I think, Mark, that is a really good example. And I think that, there are some other examples, but that one is great because it's like a widespread where it was applied to the whole population. One of the other ones that I see a lot is a lot of people are prescribed, it's nicknamed LDN, low-dose naltrexone. And this is an example where if you truly have a metabolic problem that's impacting, we've talked about this before, but the melanocortin pathway has that little substation called the POMC pathway. If you have a metabolic problem where that part of your metabolism is faltering and not strong, naltrexone can be very helpful for people like that. In the therapeutic dose range, in a normal dose where it's actually normally prescribed, where it's available and supplied at the pharmacy. But what's popular is to prescribe something called LDN, low dose naltrexone, which truly is a microdose. So the difference would be like the standard naltrexone tablet is a 50 milligram tablet, where the low dose naltrexone is 1 or 2 milligram. And and it's prescribed for various things, not so much metabolism, but it's prescribed for all kinds of things, aches, pains, neurologic stuff, GI issues. It's been one of those medicines that's just very popular and a lot of people are on it. But if you look at how it works at a low dose, it does kind of what I was just describing, but in a different way, where by taking that, it's supposed to counteract our own body's endorphin action. So it blocks our endorphin function at the receptors, the opioid receptors, and our body perceives that something's blocking it. And so then we start to produce more endorphins. And by producing more endorphins, they block our POMC function. So they're one of those things that comes from the POMC pathway, but it also has the ability to shut down that POMC pathway. So by taking the low dose, we could be weakening our metabolism. But by taking a higher dose, if we have a metabolic problem in that area, we're strengthening our metabolism. So this is what I mean is the low dose doesn't always do the same thing that the therapeutic dose does. And as you said, Mark, it's not been really studied. And with for the baby aspirin, once it was studied, we realized, oh, that isn't good. It's creating an increase in cardiovascular risk, not a decrease in those people.
And at the higher doses, naltrexone is used for people recovering from alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder.
Yes.
By blocking those receptors, it's kind of just interfering, isn't it, with those substances' ability to get to the release of endorphins? Is that the thinking?
I'm not sure what the overall mechanism of why they work in those conditions. One thing that's interesting is that POMC is also, there's something called the CART, the cocaine amphetamine pathway. And so that's our own body's area where we manufacture our own drugs, basically. And so the naltrexone regulates that part of our metabolic pathway. So I don't know if most of its action is really just from that, or if it's directly related to the opioid receptor. When it's connected to metabolism, it's partly that it enhances the ability of there's a hormone called ACTH that comes from the POMC. And the ACTH can stimulate either cortisol from our adrenal gland or something called melanocyte-stimulating hormone in our pituitary that goes on to help regulate our metabolism and our appetite. And so the naltrexone helps push energy to our metabolism and away from our cortisol. So the naltrexone in people with metabolic dysfunction, it helps like a traffic cop kind of. It says, oh no, you're not going towards the cortisol, stress hormone response, you're going to go towards a stronger metabolism response. And so how it works in like alcohol, preventing alcohol relapses, I'm not sure. But it is amazing, in the therapeutic dose range, what it does. But again, with that low dose, the microdosing, we have patients who come in on that and we have to get them off that because it's inhibiting their metabolic function.
Wow, that's interesting.
So funny, the same drug.
Yeah.
So there's got to be lots of other examples of low dose microdosing situations. Are there other kinds of drugs that people do, other types of situations? What are they?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some other ones. What I see a lot too are people sometimes take what are called glandular extracts, and those are in the form of supplements. Sometimes they're prescribed, but they're things like desiccated thyroid. So it's from pig or cow. I know, and I think you can buy these like just in the.
Like on Amazon?
I don't know. They used to be, when it was old fashioned to shop in supplement stores, but they used to be on the shelves in supplement stores. So I'm sure you could get them on Amazon, but they're like glandular adrenal gland extracts and glandular thyroid, glandular.
They probably have fancy names now, though.
Well, yeah, and it's taking a lot of them are marketed as like for your cortisol or for your stress and stuff like
Oh,
that.
there's whole sections, like at Air One, they have whole sections for stress.
Yeah, if you look at the label, you probably see some of them have bovine adrenal gland, so it's like from cows and it's ground up in there. And, so this would be another situation where you're technically microdosing hormones. And what happens when you do that? Well, your own hormones are affected. So if you are taking, say, bovine adrenal gland extract, that contains cortisol. So, and this is given to people a lot of times that have like exhaustion or something, or just stress hormone imbalances. And by taking that cortisol, or it could be prescribed, sometimes it's popular for certain practitioners to prescribe hydrocortisone in a very low dose, and that's a steroid, and just trying to help people's energy. Well, if somebody has a problem with their cortisol system, it's because there's a weakness in their system. And the weakness is usually from the brain. And it's usually, it often is metabolic. But so by taking this glandular adrenal gland, people are thinking, well, I'm just going to replace because my adrenal gland's not pumping out enough cortisol at the right time. So I'm just going to take this and it's going to help. And maybe they do feel a little more energy. But what it's doing is it's making the brain problem more dysfunctional, because now the brain is saying, oh, now I see that you don't even need me to do anything. So I'm going to just take a big back seat, and my weakness will now all of a sudden become much weaker, and my ability to regulate your adrenal gland will become much weaker because there's an artificial thing in there that is overriding the system. And so maybe I didn't explain it well, but it's really causing more dysfunction in your system when you kind of start taking hormones. Your body will become less likely to manufacture those hormones. And this is a concern that we have with even testosterone supplementation. If you give someone testosterone and they don't need it, their brain stops notifying their testicles to make any testosterone. So now they're becoming more dependent on that, what's called exogenous hormone. So whether it's testosterone for people who don't need it, whether it's these glandular extracts, whether it's potentially GLP-1 or GIP for people who don't need it, are you actually making their system less likely to be able to produce it in the future and more difficult?
Wow, that's crazy.
Right.
I'm guessing if you told those big dudes at the gym that by shooting a testosterone, they're actually cutting off the signal to their testicles, I don't think that they would be too happy about that. I don't, because that is so pervasive now, as you know, Dr. Cooper, in advertising and supplements. it's just universally believed that more testosterone, however you get it, is better.
Right. It's true.
Oh.
I mean, some people need it at different times. So it's like, why not have a full medical evaluation? Find out, are you a candidate for any kind of metabolic pharmacology? If you are, why not be serious and say, okay, well, let's just try to do a normal dose of that. And if you don't, do you really want to mess with that? Because it's unknown what it will do in the future in terms of potentially creating some kind of a dependence on that for your body to function, and also the potential for introducing, alteration in your appetite that's going to then create, that energy conservation that we always talk about, and a weaker metabolic system. So I just think, I don't really know. I mean, maybe we're going to find out that we all need microdosing of GLP-1 and GIP just because of our chemical environment that's always like inundating us with endocrine disruptors and the stress levels everyone has. Maybe we all really do need microdosing. But until there's widespread studies on general population without metabolic dysfunction, I would really try to avoid it and have more trust in our bodies to be able to balance ourselves out. You can make more beneficial changes by just improving your sleep quality, making sure that your diet has all those good foods that are good for your microbiome, fueling your exercise, things that we always talk about here about your metabolism, and doing those having those strategies will do a lot for you, versus the risk of microdosing when you don't need to. Now, I do understand some people do it because they're trying to save money. So there are people who literally need these medications, but they cannot afford the amounts that they're paying for the doses that they need. And so they're trying to make their dose last longer. And by doing that, they're functionally on a much lower dose than recommended. But I find it hard to believe they would see a whole lot of benefit from doing that. I mean, there would be cases, and as I say, I do have patients who sometimes in a tapering process do go through periods where they're on below the lowest dose as part of a tapering process. That's once they're really doing well and, they're so stable that they can be doing that. But for someone, in the midst of a problem, I don't know if that would really work.
So getting back to the GLP-1s, Dr. Cooper, why is it that when people first come to you or a provider and it's apparent that they do need to have a GLP-1, why is it that the effectiveness of the dose is so widely varied? Some people respond to a tiny dose. Some people, like Andrea, you said at some point there was so much diet damage that the meds weren't working anymore, and bariatric surgery
Right.
was the only thing. So what is it about GLP-1s, Dr. Cooper, that causes this wide range of effectiveness at different doses?
Well, I think it goes back to like the individual physiology of each person and their genetic makeup, and their diet history, and what is really going on metabolically. Because we've talked about how there can be a lot of things wrong. And if we rely on one medicine, if you have a person who has complex metabolic dysfunction, there isn't really one medicine that's going to be the key. They're going to be unhappy with the results. If they rely on just one medication, if they have a complex problem that involves a lot of these different areas of the metabolic feedback loop, because it could be that that medication, it just is too weak to correct all the dysfunction that's there. And so it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be an important component of the treatment, but it may be that they need to be looking at adding other medications to their cocktail. But it also it's really interesting how some people can be on very high doses of a lot of these meds and it just barely works. And then you have other people who take very low doses and they have dramatic results. And it is not because of anything each of these people are doing. It's not anything related to, well, this person's eating this way, this person's exercising that way. Nothing to do with that. It's much more related to their underlying physiology. And in our practice, we track everybody, as you know, and we do have about 20% of the patient population consistently that's harder, that is more in that more resistant group with treatment. And it's definitely nothing that they're doing. But what we do see is a common thread in that group. Some of these people in that group, a high percent of them, were childhood athletes, which is really interesting. Where they were seriously competitive child athletes, and they're adults now, but they did long workouts, like 4-hour practices. You have gymnastics, dance is another one, swimming. And these competitive child athletes that were doing those really long practices during the developmental stages and not fueling well, those patients, a lot of the ones that we find that are in that resistant group have that history, which is really interesting. Or massive dieting history too. And so we're still working with that group, and we can track a lot of the people that are in that group. They do get out of that group and they do respond eventually once you kind of figure out what strategy will work for them and once they're far enough away from that underfueling situation. But it is really interesting. And then there's different genetics. There's also people who have like severe genetic dysfunction that can be detected through genetic testing, and so their response may be not as robust either. But even within the same families, you see this. The other thing to think about is people are on medications that also block the effect of the metabolic medications. So they have weight-promoting medications in the mix that they need to be on for various reasons, and then we're trying to, do the opposite. So they may be in a resistant group. But there's all kinds of reasons for it, but it is fascinating that no two people are the same.
This might be a bit off track, but I'm still curious, Dr. Cooper, why GLP-1s are effective at treating both diabetes and weight loss and obesity. What is it about the drug that does both of those things? They seem like completely disconnected, or maybe they're not. But why is that?
Well, they're not disconnected. Diabetes and obesity share a common underlying pathophysiology. It doesn't mean that someone with obesity will have diabetes, but for type 2 diabetes, the vast majority do have high body weight in type 2. Not everyone, but the vast majority. But it's the same metabolic pathway that influences glucose, insulin, leptin, ghrelin, GLP-1, GIP, all of those hormones are involved in both of these diagnoses. And so that's where the term diabesity comes from, because sometimes people have both conditions, but it's really to describe the common underlying pathophysiology between the two. And they're both very highly genetically related. So the family history is strong for both of those conditions.
Wow. So in diabetics, their blood sugar is high, and that's connected to the amount of calories that get stored as fat. Is that what how the GLP-1s act? Or I'm still a little unclear.
Well, so the action also is very interesting. The action of GLP-1 and GIP is different in diabetes versus obesity without diabetes. The drug actually has a different action because part of its action is what's called glucose dependent. So it only kicks in, it has different features that only kick in if you have a high blood sugar level. So if you have diabetes, the glucose dependent components of the drug capacity are that if your glucose is high, these medications stimulate the production of more insulin by your pancreas in order to pull that glucose down, right? But if you have normal glucose, you don't have that happen. That doesn't kick in. If your glucose is high, these drugs also help reduce, or at least the GLP-1s primarily, help reduce glucagon glucagon's another hormone from the pancreas that is supposed to turn off, supposed to go way down if your glucose is high, because its job is to help the liver dump out more glucose when you're fasting. But in diabetes, there's dysfunction. And in normal diabetes patients, they have inappropriately elevated glucagon. So that is contributing to their high glucose. And they have insufficient insulin. So that is also contributing to their high glucose. So the GLP-1 is perfectly made for that situation, because then when the glucose is high, it normalizes the insulin and glucagon response. So it's fantastic in that way. But GLP-1 and GIP are different. They don't both do the same thing. And so the GIP does not have as much positive impact on the glucagon situation in patients with diabetes, but it has more impact on insulin resistance improvement than the GLP-1 does. So this is why careful selection of medication for the patient is so important, because some patients they need more of the GLP-1 than they do of the GIP, or vice versa. So for diabetes, it's very, very helpful. But by balancing out the glucose, insulin, and the glucagon levels, that does improve metabolic function a lot. And so that improvement in metabolic function helps facilitate that body weight reduction also.
Wow, that is so complicated.
It's so complicated.
Well,
And to know which drug is right for you, you really need to be tested to see what's better for your body.
you really do. And we've also talked about, we're talking about microdosing on this episode, but we've talked in a prior episode about potential risk of being too high on the dose too, where we were talking about that potentially there could become a resistance to the hormone that the drug is sending out. So we talked about that with the tirzepatide, that what we are observing sometimes in some patients is when they were doing fine, but we're thinking maybe a higher dose would be helpful. But as you go up on the higher dose, you're seeing less response, and you're seeing like an increase in the things that that drug is supposed to be improving. And so there's the possibility that also the upper end of the dose range may also not be optimal for certain people, because it may trigger a resistance to that hormone. And then the hormone, instead of you're increasing the power of it, you're actually going to decrease the power by putting in too much of that hormone that creates this resistance at the receptor level. So it is complicated. You've got to find the sweet spots of treatment for every patient, basically. And
Wow.
and it's not the same for every patient.
Is that what happens in insulin resistance? When insulin levels are too high, then your body just kind of gets used to it?
Yeah, when it's too high, the receptors start to not respond to it as much. It's overloading the receptors to the point where they kind of numb out.
They're like, get out of my hair.
Yeah.
Been there, done that. Get away from me.
And so we're thinking of, there's a theme going on here. So if you think about, and that happens when people take insulin too for diabetes. So that's why their insulin requirement tends to go up and up and up and up, where they need more and more and more. And the high insulin drives more of the glucose into the body fat. So that's why they also are gaining weight while they're on this insulin regimen. So what we have to take away from this microdosing idea is, if you're on the very low end, below a therapeutic range, what happens to your hormones? Do they become lazy and just not function? And so then you're actually getting a weaker hormonal response overall when you thought you were enhancing your hormonal response. And then same thing on the opposite side, on the high end of the dosing spectrum, are we getting any kind of resistance showing up to the drug? So we're getting less hormone response. So again, too low or too high might be an issue, and a similar issue, because both could result in less of the hormone response that you're looking for.
Wow, this has been fascinating. Andrea, any final thoughts as we head out?
I just say you always have to be careful no matter what you're taking. It's a drug, a supplement, or a shot, or a pill, or a whatever. It really is. It's all drugs. I mean, you really need to be careful of what you're taking and what you're putting in your body. It all can mess you up, or it can all make you better.
Yeah. And I think the takeaway for me, Dr. Cooper, is that a lot of this microdosing, I think, is being done by people who are not under the supervision of a doctor, and that's kind of a gray area to be in when you are taking something and not really knowing what the end effect is going to be. Any final thoughts from you, Dr. Cooper?
Well, yeah, I just think, to be smart about everything and just try to don't feel desperate that you must, take a microdose to like lose 10 pounds or something or for an event. I mean, that could, again, have you going down a path that could lead to long-term issues that you're not, not expecting. And so, but we don't know. We don't know. And so, can we trust our body the way it is? Can we love our body the way it is and avoid kind of putting ourselves in jeopardy? That's kind of the hope. But there's so much peer pressure. There's so much now societal pressure that everybody needs these meds. And it's just not true. Everybody does not need the meds. A huge number of people do. But there are still some of our population that does not.
Well, we've learned a great lesson today, how microdosing can backfire. All right, thanks you two for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.